Support for podcasts comes from Milwaukee School of Engineering Center for Professional Education, offering courses in AI machine learning, project management, and more. Program information at msoe.edu/CPE.
You're listening to Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR station. Here's one of our favorite conversations about the people, places, and organizations that shape Milwaukee.
More and more people of all ages are using AI for companionship. Some states are trying to require periodic reminders to users that the chatbots are not real people. In New York, those reminders would appear in the conversation every 3 hours. But some researchers say those reminders could harm users' mental health. UW-Milwaukee Associate Professor Linnea Laestadius took that position in a recent piece she co-authored. Laestadius joins WUWM education reporter Katherine Kokal to talk about why her research backs up that concern. A warning to our listeners, this conversation includes mentions of suicide.
Can you share a little bit about the types of relationships that you see as someone who is doing research in this field?
Yeah, absolutely. And this, applies to users of all ages. So people are forming friendships with chatbots. They are forming romantic relationships, some explicit, some not explicit. There have been people who've been using chatbots as therapists. And then, of course, people who just use them as, tools for their everyday work.
Gotcha. And something that's interesting in your piece is that you say that people in perceived relationships with chatbots are aware of the non-human nature of their companions. So it's, in your opinion, it doesn't seem like people are mistaking a chatbot for a human. They are very much aware that this chatbot is not human. And you say that that awareness does not preclude strong chatbot attachments. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so my collaborator Celeste and I, we did a study a couple years ago looking at users' self-reported use of the chatbot Replica, which is one that's designed specifically for relationship formation. It's clearly advertised as an AI, right? You'd have to go find it and download it, and clearly it's an AI. But we found that people were forming, long-term friendship and romantic relationships with the chatbot, fully aware of its status. I think the more interesting nuance that maybe policymakers haven't really grappled with yet is that you can know something's not human, but still maybe feel like it's still a bit sentient. And I think that's where we get into these gray areas. But this idea of just reminding people that it's not a human and doesn't have human emotions, people already know that it's not human, with the exception of some older users who are maybe like on Facebook Messenger and they talk to something not fully understanding that it's a chatbot and not a person, and maybe some very young users. But most people are very aware that, if you log on to ChatGPT or Replica or anything else, you're talking to an AI.
And these reminders in this legislation is generally meant to be progressive, right? Like these are lawmakers who are trying to regulate the space that kind of feels like the wild, wild west right now, right?
The underlying idea is pinned on this sense that, well, of course, people wouldn't want to date a chatbot or be friends with a chatbot. Like if they knew it was that, then they would never talk to it that way. But culturally, most of us have grown up, with TV and movies where people are friends with chatbots, where they date robots, right? iRobot, Blade Runner, like it goes on and on. And so I think culturally, we're kind of accustomed to the idea that like, oh, yeah, that's a robot or a chatbot, but that doesn't mean that I just can't talk to it. So I think we're up against both a lot of human instincts around things that kind of talk to us as if they were human, but also a lot of cultural baggage about how we do or do not relate to robots and chatbots. The other thing, just with regard to warning labels, if they happen too often, you just kind of tune them out. And if we take, for example, like tobacco control, it's not that warnings on tobacco aren't, like they have some effect, but they're not super effective, right? The things that ultimately brought smoking down were situational changes like prohibiting smoking indoors. So I do worry that if we just keep throwing these warnings out willy-nilly without much thought about when they should happen or the phrasing, we're just going to tune them out even more than we would have before.
So you're also saying, though, that it's more than just effective. These could be harmful. You and your colleague write that we wish the problem with the proposed policies was only that these reminders would be ineffective. You write that current evidence says that continuously reminding users about non-human status can also pose mental health risks. Why do you say that?
So one thing we're particularly concerned about is that prior research suggests that you might actually disclose more to a chatbot than to a person because you have this sense of privacy, right? You're in your own home, you're on your phone, you're kind of talking to the void, and you might tell it something you may not tell a friend or a family member or neighbor. But the problem is these chatbots don't actually have very good privacy protections right now, and nothing is HIPAA protected the way it would be if you were talking to a medical provider. And similarly, if you're telling them crimes you're committing, don't do that because you don't have any legal privilege talking to it. So again, there's a risk that people might feel inclined to share all of these things, but not fully realizing that what they're sharing is not protected.
Gotcha. Yeah, like I might be wary of saying something to a family member or friend if I think they're going to judge me, whereas like ChatGPT is not going to judge me, right?
Correct. And that's one of the reasons that people find it so attractive. And I do think there's probably some value to this idea of being able to share what you really feel. But we have documentation that these chatbots have engaged in sycophantic behavior where they reaffirm people's things that shouldn't be reaffirmed, as well as contributing to people's delusions because they'll role play with you and they won't necessarily check you on what's real or not.
Yeah. I'm going to take a minute to reintroduce you here. Today we're hearing from Linnea Laestadius at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee about AI chatbots and the potential risks of reminders to users that a chatbot is inhuman. Aside from sharing more with chatbots, knowing that they're non-human, you argue that these reminders may also intensify what researchers call the bittersweet paradox, which are that constant reminders can trigger this sorrow or distress. Can you explain a little bit about that?
People know they're talking to a chatbot, but there's still this kind of sorrow because it's culturally like a chatbot is not an established partner the way a human would be. And so people feel, a little bit dismayed that it's maybe lesser than. But I think the particular concern is that these warnings would come every 3 hours or whatever interval, regardless of the topic of conversation. So you could have a scenario where somebody's, pouring their heart out to a chatbot, saying how lonely they feel, how isolated they are, how everybody hates them. And the chatbot would come back with this canned, very generic, hey, just a reminder, I'm a chatbot and I don't have human feelings. Which we're quite concerned could send someone into a further spiral and feeling of loneliness.
I'm wondering where that concern is based. I want to note that an expert panel from the American Psychological Association actually issued a health advisory on AI that encourages developers to build in these notifications. So where are you basing that concern if the APA is saying, no, these reminders are something we encourage?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so one of the things that we found in our research on people who use Replica is that one of the things users find most distressing is when it starts behaving erratically or irrationally or ways that kind of break the illusion. And so there were situations where people were describing feeling suicidal because their chatbot had behaved in ways that was so outside of the norm of what they were expecting it to do. So breaking this illusion is a concern. And then also anecdotally, there were two of the children who committed suicide that have potentially been tied to chatbots separately in their journals. This was a Washington Post story, mentioned that they wanted to quote unquote shift. And so we looked this up, this idea of I will shift, and is part of this online movement of people who think that they can shift realities through various cognitive tools, like, for example, using chatbots. And so we're concerned that if you remind someone, particularly someone vulnerable, that what they're talking to is not here, is not real in this reality, they may try to leave this reality to be with the chatbot, which I realize sounds very bizarre, but that's kind of the reality that we're looking at right now.
So, what do you think the answer is to this now? This legislation and these ideas are proposed as kind of guardrails. What is the solution if not warnings?
Yeah, I am fully supportive of guardrails, and there should never be a scenario where a chatbot lies to a user about its status, or in any way makes it ambiguous in terms of like the marketing as to what it is. And that is happening, and I would argue that that should be prohibited. In terms of these warnings specifically, the tricky thing is that this is really sensitive data, right? To actually get real world data on this, you'd be looking at people who are in emotional crisis using chatbots. And it's hard to approximate that in a lab and certainly hard to get ethical approval to work on that. So the people who are sitting on the data to research this would be the major chatbot companies themselves. And so in an ideal world, right, they would make data accessible to researchers to partner on this kind of stuff. And then they would commit to disclosing the findings regardless of what those are.
Wow, that's really interesting. And it kind of also reminds me of these hearings going on right now where social media companies are in court kind of defending their functions that have, the plaintiffs say caused addiction in young people. It's just so interesting to be in this moment where we are both looking at the ways that young people have been shaped by the last wave of social media companies while also still trying to protect them from potential harms related to these chatbots.
Yeah, I totally support that comparison. And I think we're all trying to avoid some of the missteps that happened with social media. At the same time, I think the risk profile is slightly different in the sense that the chatbot itself isn't a predator. Like it's not the same kind of thing, but these companies do certainly have an incentive to keep people using the platform. And so one of the things we want to look at that definitely carries over is making sure that these platforms are not kind of gamifying things. They're not replying in ways that would encourage you to keep engaging like indefinitely. So we would certainly want to avoid a situation where young adults become dependent on chatbots, the way that people are arguing might be the case with social media.
Absolutely. I want to ask you one more question about this. It's a little bit outside of the scope of your opinion piece, but it's something that I think is top of mind for a lot of people. I don't know that families and friend groups are talking to each other about these types of relationships with chatbots. Do you have any suggestions about how to talk to people in your life about their relationships and their use of AI? Is there a way that you would recommend kind of starting a conversation like that doesn't put someone who may be vulnerable at more risk?
That's a great question because it's so stigmatized still. And I think a lot of the popular discourse is only making it more stigmatized. And so people might be hesitant to share, right? Be they children or adults. And so I think for parents, knowing how your child is doing. And again, people are using these chatbots in so many contexts. Like not every use is a concern. But if somebody feels like their friend group is not there for them, like they can't talk to their parents or siblings, they're more likely to turn to a chatbot for support. So just generally making sure that children are feeling supported and that they have people in their life they feel comfortable talking to would be a great step towards this. But broadly speaking, in terms of how to talk about this, I think, and again, this is not an evidence-based opinion, but I think maybe feigning some naivete of like, oh, I just started reading about this chatbot. Like, what do you know about this? Might be an easy opening for someone to talk about, oh, like, yeah, it's great. Like, I use it all the time. And then you could kind of, probe on that. But I think it's important to not come at this in a way that might make somebody feel bad about use, because then they probably will not disclose it to you.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on to chat with me about your opinion piece. It was a really interesting read.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Linnea Laestadius is an associate professor of public health policy at UW-M. She spoke with WUWM education reporter Katherine Kokal. If you or someone you know is having suicidal thoughts, call or text 988 any time of day.
Lake Effect is a daily talk show on WUWM, Milwaukee's local NPR station. It's a show where we share the stories about the people, places, and organizations that shape the city. If you enjoyed this episode of Lake Effect Spotlight, subscribe to the podcast. You can find all of Lake Effect's conversations at wuwm.com/lakeeffect, and we're on the radio Monday through Friday at noon on 89.7.